Wine was rushing around, clearly in a state of panic. Mrs. June called out to her, "Why are you running, sweetie? Slow down." "But, Mom, look, the maid has not set these flowers in the wash. Thing's favorite flowers are here." Mrs. June smiled gently and spoke, "Yes, Wine, I know, but you need to take care of yourself too." She called the maid over and instructed her to arrange the flowers. As Wine had mentioned, Wine walked into the kitchen, her worry still evident. "Is everything ready?" she asked the maids who were busy cooking. "Yes, ma'am, it's almost ready." "Did you make the strawberry shake?" The maid laughed awkwardly. "I was about to start it." Wine sighed. "How many times do I have to tell you we don't tolerate disobedience? Everything has to be perfect, and Theung likes everything on time. Give me the ingredients, I will make it myself." The maid started to panic, clearly embarrassed. "No, ma'am, I'll do it." "It's okay, you go and turn off the stove." Wyan made the shake and put it in the fridge. As she was heading to the dining area, she heard noises coming from the living room. Curious, she went to investigation. Wyan's point of view, it's still early. Why are there noises in the living room? Could he have arrived already? When Wine entered the living room, her legs froze, and her eyes met those of her one and only husband. A smile spread across her face, and she ran toward him. Tim also walked towards her, and they embraced in a warm hug. Mrs. June watched them with a fond smile, clearly touched by the scene. The maids were setting the dishes on the dining table for lunch. As all the family members had gathered, Wine, feeling playful, turned to Theung with a wink. "So, how's my lovely hubby doing today?" Theung smiled at her, his eyes full of affection. "I'm doing great, and after all that hard work, I finally made it back to you." Wine giggled, and Theung kissed her forehead tenderly. Their moment of happiness was suddenly interrupted by the sound of shattering glass nearby. They turned to see Jungkook sitting at the table, blood dripping from his hands. Mrs. Jones rushed over, her voice filled with concern. "Jungkook, are you out of your mind? Look at your hand. There are so many cuts." Jungkook didn't respond to his mother. His intense gaze remained fixed on Wine, his eyes searching hers. Wine hesitated but met his stare. Feeling a chill as his look deepened, Wine quickly get the first aid kit. Wine hurried to fetch the kit, her heart racing. As she returned, a maid approached. "Lunch is ready." Mrs. Jones glanced at the table, then back at Jungkook's injury. "Wine, you can bandage his hands. The lunch will get cold, and you know how Theung is about that." Wine forced a smile and nodded. Though deep down a wave of anxiety washed over her. She was scared of Jungkook. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her uneasy. Everyone moved to the dining area, but Wine sat beside Jungkook on the sofa to tend to his wounds. Her hands trembled as she carefully wrapped the bandage around his hand. Jungkook remained silent, watching her with an unreadable expression. Wine's point of view. Why does he make me feel this way? Why does he always have to look at me like that? Despite her shaking hands, she tried to focus on the bandage, but the air between them felt thick with tension. "Why are you trembling?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, and it made Wine's heart race even faster. She glanced at him quickly before focusing back on the bandage, trying to avoid his gaze. Wine didn't reply, focusing on bandaging Jungkook's hands. Her heart still racing, but suddenly she felt his hand on her cheek, forcing her to look up at him. His touch was firm, and his eyes held a dark intensity. I asked you something. It's nothing, brother. She stammered, trying to remain calm. That was it. She could see something shift in his eyes in an instant. He pressed his lips against hers, harsh and unrelenting. Wine's eyes widened in shock as she struggled to push him away. It felt like fighting against a mountain. Her strength was nothing compared to his. Tears streamed down her face, but Jungkook finally pulled back, a twisted smirk on his lips. What's the matter? You didn't enjoy kissing me just a while ago. Your so called husband was kissing you, and you seemed fine with that. Why not me? Mine's voice trembled as she tried to reason with him. Please don't do this. You know I'm your brother's wife. I. Before she could finish, he cut her off again, biting her lips harshly, sending a sharp pain through her. You really know how to get under my skin, he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. He stood up, glaring down at her as she wiped the tears and blood from his lips. Shaken and terrified, Wine quickly gathered herself and walked to the dining area. Her legs barely holding her up in the dining area, the sound of cutlery clinking against plates filled the room. Wine sat between Taehyung and Jungkook, feeling the tension thick in the air. Taehyung, sitting to her left, gently held her left hand with his right, eating with his left hand, while Wine quietly ate with her right. Mrs. Jones, noticing the odd arrangement, raised an eyebrow. Why aren't you using your left hand? Wine smiled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond before she could say anything. Tim chuckled and playfully raised both their intertwined hands into the air. Because they won't let her go, he teased. His voice light-hearted. Wine's smile faltered as she felt Jungkook's cold gaze landed on them. Again, the warmth she had moments ago with Taehyung faded quickly. She tried to focus on her food, but suddenly she felt a hand on her thigh creeping under the table. Her body stiffened. She coughed sharply, unable to hide her reaction. Taehyung immediately turned to her concerned. Are you okay? Here, drink some water, he said, handing her a glass. Wine took a few sips, her hands trembling slightly, and gave him a weak smile. Thank you. She whispered, her voice still shaky. Jungkook, however, kept his focus on his meal, acting as though nothing had happened. But Wine could feel the weight of his presence. The silent threat behind his casual demeanor. After lunch, everyone sat in the living room, chatting happily except for Jungkook. He stayed quiet, not joining in the conversation. It was clear he wasn't happy about his stepbrother. Tyun being back, Jungkook being a mafia leader had his own reasons for staying distant. And as people say, when a mafia man falls for someone, things can get very dangerous. The first month after Taehyung's return seemed to go well. He had spent years studying in America, and settling back into life here wasn't easy, but he made it work. Soon, he took over managing his father's business. Jungkook never showed much interest in the business world as his focus was on his darker, secretive life. Wine always felt uneasy around Jungkook because of that. His presence made her nervous. Knowing what he was capable of, one day Taehyung went to a restaurant for a meeting with a friend. It was just supposed to be a regular lunch, nothing special, but while he was there, something terrible happened. Someone attacked him. In a matter of moments, Taehyung was gone. The news broke Wine's heart. Taehyung, her loving husband, had been taken from her just like that, leaving the family in shock and grief. When Wine heard the news of Taehyung's death, it felt like the ground slipped from beneath her feet. Her world shattered in an instant. She locked herself in the room and didn't come out for almost 2 weeks. The whole house was filled with sadness and grief. Everyone was heartbroken, especially Vine, who couldn't face the reality of losing her husband. During the investigation, Jungkook found out that Taehyung's death was caused by one of his enemies, fueled by anger and revenge. Jungkook tracked the man down and killed him. When Mrs. June heard what Jungkook had done, she felt a sense of relief. Finally, justice was served, or so she thought. Mrs. June quickly went to Wine's room and softly knocked on the door before entering. She sat beside Wine, who was still curled up on the bed, her face pale and tear strange. Wine, my dear, I have news, she said gently. Jungkook has taken care of the person who hurt you. He's gone now. You don't have to worry anymore. But Wine just stared blankly, her pain too deep to be healed by revenge. Mrs. Jones sat quietly beside Wine, waiting for a reaction. The room was heavy with sorrow, the air still as Wine kept staring blankly at the wall, not saying a word. Wine, Mrs. Jones' voice broke softly. I know this doesn't bring him back, but I wanted you to know that justice has been served. Jungkook made sure of it. Wine slowly turned her head towards Mrs. Jones, her eyes dull and lifeless. Justice, she whispered, her voice hoarse from days of crying. What does it matter now? He's gone. Nothing can bring him back. Mrs. Jones sighed, her heart itching for Wine's pain. I know, sweetheart. I know, but you can't live like this. Tim wouldn't want you to suffer alone. He loved you so much. Tears welled up in Wine's eyes again as she shook her head. He's gone, Mom. He left me without even saying goodbye. How am I supposed to live without him? Everything feels empty. Mrs. Jones reached out, taking Wine's cold hands into her own. I can't imagine what you are feeling, but you are not alone, Vine. We're all here for you. Please don't lock yourself away forever. Tim would want you to keep going to find strength. Vine's tears finally spilled over, her body shaking with silent sobs. I don't know how, she whispered brokenly. I don't know how to live without him. Mrs. Jones pulled her into a gentle embrace, letting Vine cry against her shoulder. You will find a way, my dear, one day at a time, and we will be here to help you every step of the way. Wine sat on the edge of her bed, lost in the silence of her room, the weight of grief still heavy on her heart. The room was dim, the curtains drawn tight, shutting out the outside world. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed from the door, breaking the stillness. Who's there? She asked quietly, her voice weak. There was no answer. She frowned, waiting for a moment, but the room fell back into silence. Just as she turned back towards the bed, another knock sounded this time, a little louder. Uneasy, White stood up and walked slowly to the door. Her hand hesitated on the handle for a moment before she pulled it open. Her breath catch in her throat as she saw who was standing there. It was Jungkook. She stammered, taking a step back instinctively. Jungkook stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but there was something dark in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at her as if waiting for her to speak. Wine's heart pounded in her chest, the air between them thick with tension. Can I come in? He finally asked, his voice calm but cold. Wine hesitated, unsure of what to do. Her mind was racing. Why was he here? And what did he want from her? Wine's heart raced as she stepped aside, allowing Jungkook to enter. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a growing sense of unease as he crossed the threshold, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Jungkook's gaze never left her. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before landing back on Wine. His expression was calm, but something about it felt dangerous. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Why are you here, Jungkook? Jungkook took a step closer, making her instinctively take one step back. I came to see you, he said simply, but his tone held an edge. Why am I not allowed to check on my brother's widow? Why stiffen at the word widow? It still felt unreal to her. I don't need you to check on me, she whispered, trying to hold herself together. I'm fine on my own. Jungkook smirked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You're fine, he repeated mockingly. You have been locked in here for weeks. Fine. You barely talk to anyone, and yet you're fine. You are lying to yourself. His words felt like sharp needles poking at the fragile state Wine was in. She clenched her fists, trying to hold back the tears threatening to spill. What do you care? She snapped, surprising even herself. You never cared before. Tim is gone, and now you suddenly show up like you care. Jungkook's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. He closed the distance between them in a few swift steps, forcing Wine to step back until her back hit the wall. Don't talk to me like that, he growled softly, his voice low and dangerous. You think I don't care? I have always been here. Wine, watching, waiting just because Tim's gone doesn't mean I'll let you slip away. Wine's breath hissed, fear and confusion swirling inside her. Jungkook, I'm your brother's wife, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You shouldn't be here. Jungkook's eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. You were his wife, he corrected, his voice cold as ice, but now you belong to no one, and that means I can do whatever I want. Wine's heart pounded in her chest, panic rising. She pushed against his chest, trying to put distance between them, but he didn't budge. Please don't do this, she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't belong to anyone, especially not you. Jungkook chuckled darkly, stepping even closer until their faces were mere inches apart. Oh, Ryan, he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. You will always belong to someone. And right now, that someone is me. Jungkook's presence loomed over Ryan like a storm cloud, his anger and frustration palpable. She stood trembling against the wall, her heart racing as Jungkook's eyes narrowed, a dangerous gleam reflecting in their depths. You think you can just shut me out? His voice was a low growl, his tone icy and cutting. You think you can ignore me and get away with it? Wine shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Didn't mean to. Jungkook interrupted, his face inches from hers. You have been avoiding me, pretending I don't exist. Taehyung is gone, but that doesn't mean you can escape me. Wine's breath hitched, her fear rising. She tried to back away, but the wall behind her offered no escape. Jungkook's eyes were cold and unyielding, his anger barely contained. Please, Jungkook, she pleaded, her voice quivering. I'm still grieving. I need space. Space? He repeated mockingly. You think you deserve space after everything? After what happened? No, Wine, you are going to face this head on. Before Wine could react, Chunko grabbed her wrist with a force that made her wince. He pushed her gently but firmly against the wall, his body pressing close to hers. His face was a mask of intense, unyielding resolve. Stop, she begged, her eyes filling with tears. Please, stop, he murmured, his voice razorously soft. You wanted me to stop ignoring you, didn't you? Now you will get my full attention. Jungkook's eyes flickered with a cold determination as he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. You think you are the only one hurting? He whispered harshly. I'm angry, Ryan, angry at the world, at Thung's death, and most of all, at you for trying to push me away. Ryan shivered at his words, feeling trapped in a situation she couldn't control. Her hands trembled as she tried to push him away, but he was unrelenting. Jungkook's grip tightened, his gaze piercing into hers. Jungkook, please, she sobbed, her voice breaking. Jungkook's expression softened for a fleeting moment before hardening again. He finally released her wrist, stepping back slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on her, full of a cold, unsettling intensity. You are going to have to handle it, Wine, he said, his voice a low rumble, whether you like it or not. Wine slumped against the wall, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. Jungkook turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the room, her heart still pounding from the encounter. Jungkook stood at the threshold of Wine's room, his expression a mix of anger and determination. He had just forced her into a confrontation she wasn't ready for, and now he had another matter to address. You know, Wine, he said coldly, I'll be talking to mom about this. I'm going to ask her for permission to marry you. One's eyes widened in shock, her voice trembling as she tried to process his words. What? If you're the last man on earth, I wouldn't marry you, she replied firmly, trying to mask her fear with defiance. Jungkook's lips curled up into a smile, an unsettling mix of satisfaction and amusement dancing in his eyes. We will see about that, he said smoothly. You might change your mind, or you might not have a choice. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving Vine standing there, her heart racing. Jungkook made his way to his mother's room, his footsteps echoing through the hallway. He knocked lightly before entering. Mrs. Yoon looked up from her desk, her eyes filled with curiosity. Jungkook, what brings you here? She asked, her voice warm but puzzled. I need to talk to you, he said, closing the door behind him. I want to marry Vine. Mrs. Jones' eyebrows shot up in surprise, but she quickly masked her reaction with a thoughtful expression. Mary Wine, she repeated. Why the sudden scene? It's not sudden, he replied, his tone calm but resolute. I have been thinking about it for a while. Now that the young is gone, I want to make her mine. I believe it's the right thing to do. Mrs. Jones leaned back in her chair, considering his words carefully. All right, she said slowly. I will talk to Wine about it. Tomorrow, it's important to make sure she is on board with this. Jungkook noted, a satisfied smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Thank you, mother. I appreciate it. With that, Jungkook turned and left the room, leaving Mrs. Jones deep in thought. As he walked away, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The path was set, and he was prepared to see it through. The next morning, Mrs. June walked down the hallway carrying a tray of food, a soft smile on her face. She knocked gently on Vine's door before entering. Good morning, Vine, she said cheerfully, setting the tray down on the small table by the window. I brought you some breakfast. I thought it might be nice to share a meal with you. Vine, still in her pajamas, looked up from the bed where she had been sitting quietly. She offered a faint smile as she took in the sights of Mrs. Jones' warm demeanor. Thank you, Mrs. Jones, she said softly, her voice still tinged with the weariness of recent days. Mrs. Jones settled into a chair next to Wine, her expression turning more serious as she began to speak. Wine, I wanted to talk to you about something important. Jungkook has expressed his desire to marry you. He is very serious about it. Wine's expression faltered, her eyes widening in shock. Marry Jungkook, she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. Why would you want that? He believes it's the right thing to do, Mrs. Jones said gently. With Taehyung gone, Jungkook feels a responsibility to step in. He cares for you, Wine, and I think you should consider his proposal. Wine's face fell and she shook her head firmly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones, but I can't marry Jungkook. I don't want to be with him. I need time to heal, and I don't think this is right. Mrs. Jones' smile slowly faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. Her tone shifted dramatically, becoming icy and demanding. I don't think you understand the situation, Vine, she said sharply. Jungkook is not someone you can refuse. He's done a lot for this family, and his feelings for you are serious. It's not just about what you want. Vine looked at her in shock, the warmth in Mrs. Jones' demeanor gone, replaced by a harshness she had never been seen before. But I have my own feelings too, Vine protested, her voice trembling. I can't be forced into this. Forced, Mrs. Jones' voice grew colder, her eyes narrowing. You think you are in a position to refuse? You are grieving, and that's understandable, but don't be naive. Jungkook will not be patient forever. If you continue to resist, there will be consequences. Wine's eyes widened in fear, the coldness in Mrs. Jones' voice making her shiver. Consequences? What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Jones stood up, her posture rigid and uncompromising. You will have to figure that out for yourself. She sat, her tone icy, but understand this, Jungkook is not a man you cross lightly. It's in your best interest to reconsider your position. With that, Mrs. Jones turned and left the room, leaving Wine alone with her fear and confusion. The tray of food remained untouched, a stark reminder of the harsh reality that had just been thrust upon her. One was still shaken by Mrs. Jones' harsh demeanor when she found herself alone in the house. With Mr. and Mrs. Jones away and the maids absent, the silence of the house felt oppressive as she wandered through the empty rooms. When she entered the living room, her heart nearly stopped. Jungkook was lying on the sofa, his posture exuding an air of dominance. His eyes locked onto her as she stepped in, and she felt an immediate surge of fear. Morning wine, he said, his voice smooth yet laced with an undercurrent of menace. Looks like we have the house to ourselves. Wine's pulse quickened, and she quickly avoided her gaze. She could barely manage a whispered response. Good morning, Jungkook. She said, her voice trembling. I didn't expect to see you alone. Jungkook's eyes narrowed as he patted the space beside him on the sofa. His tone was commanding, leaving no room for refusal. Come sit with me, he ordered. We need to talk. Trembling, Wine moved to the sofa and sat down at the far end, her body tense and her heart pounding. Jungkook shifted closer, closing the distance between them with an intimidating presence. What do you want to talk about? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite her fear. Jungkook leaned in, his eyes cold and unrelenting. His voice was low, but it carried a menacing edge. I want to talk about us, he said. I'm done waiting for you to come around. My mother made it clear marriage is expected. I want you to understand that this is non negotiable. Wine's eyes widened in terror and she shook her head desperately. I can't marry you, she said, her voice cracking. I don't want this. I need time. Jungkook's expression darkened and he grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to look directly at him. His grip was firm, almost painful. You don't get to decide what you want right now, he said harshly. You are going to marry me and you are going to accept it. Before White could react, Jungkook leaned in and captured her lips in a rough, demanding. Wine's eyes widened in shock, and she tried to pull away, but Jungkook's grip held her firmly in place. No, stop! She cried out, but her words were muffled against his mouth. Jungkook's uh, was aggressive and forceful, his hands moving to her waist as he pressed her body against his. Wine struggled, her hands pushing weakly against his chest, but her efforts were futile. You need to learn to listen, he said between his voice had a low growl. This is how it's going to be. You can fight it, but you won't win. Wine's tears streamed down her face as she tried to escape, her fear and desperation overwhelming her. His hands exploring her body with a possessive urgency. When he finally pulled away, he looked at her with a cold satisfaction. Wine's breath came in vague gasps as she wipes her tears. Her fear palpable. I'm not here to negotiate, he said firmly. You will accept this one way or another. It's only a matter of time. He stood up and walked away, leaving Wine trembling on the sofa, her body still reacting to the intensity of what had just happened. The room felt colder, the silence more oppressive as Wine struggled to come to terms with the harsh reality of the situation. Wine's heart pounding in her chest as she fled from the living room. Tears streaming down her face, she ran into her bedroom, slammed the door behind her, and locked it with shaking hands. The sound of her sobs echoed off the walls as she collapsed onto her bed, burying her face in her hands. After a while, she decided she needed to do something to calm herself. The only thought that offered her some relief was a hot shower. She stood up, still sobbing, and made her way to the bathroom. The water was warm and soothing, and she let it wash away the traces of her fear and despair. When she finally emerged from the shower, she wrapped herself in a towel, her body still trembling. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and walked back towards her bedroom. The house was silent, and she hoped for a moment of peace. But as soon as she reached the bedroom door, she heard a key turn in the lock. Her heart skipped a beat, the door swung open, and Jungkook stepped into the room. his expression dark and resolute. Jungkook, she exclaimed, her voice filled with panic. How did you get in here? Jungkook's gaze was cold and unwielding. He held up the key and he had used to unlock the door, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. You didn't think you could lock me out, did you? He said, his voice dripping with authority. I have a key to every door in this house. Wine's breath hitched as she backed away from him, her fear palpable. She tried to cover herself with the shawl, but it felt like a flimsy barrier against his intensity. Please, Jungkook, she begged, her voice trembling. I'm begging you, don't do this. Jungkook's eyes hardened and he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He reached out, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her towards him. One's body pressed against the wall as she tried to resist. But Jungkook's grip was firm. You're going to learn to accept what's coming, he said, his voice low and menacing. You don't get to refuse me. Before Wine could react, Jungkook's lips were on hers. His kiss rough and forceful, Wine's eyes widened in shock, and she tried to push him away, but her efforts were futile. Jungkook's kiss was relentless, and his hands roamed over her towel-clad body, his touch invasive and commanding. No, stop, she cried out, her voice muffled against his mouth. Please let me go. Jungkook's response was a harsh growl, his grip tightening as he pressed her body against the wall. He continued to kiss her with a demanding intensity, his actions leaving her feeling powerless and trapped. You need to understand your place. He said between kisses, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. This is the way things are. You will accept it. White tears streamed down her face as she struggled against him, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Jungkook's kiss and touch were unrelenting, and Wine felt utterly broken and helpless. When Jungkook finally pulled away, he looked at her with a cold satisfaction. Wine's breath came in vague gasps as she tried to regain her composure, her body still reacting to the intensity of what had just happened. You can fight it all you want, he said firmly, but you will learn to accept this. There is no other way.